everyone, my name is Nata. Welcome to this video on data collection for lifecycle assessments. This video consists of two parts. This one is the first part, and it focuses more on the general aspects of the data collection. And the second video will go more into detail on how to collect the data and specific tips and tricks for data collection. This video is here for you to understand what the data collection process looks like. And of course, if you have any additional questions, then you can always ask us. Data is the most important building block of any lifecycle assessments. Our LCAs, and hopefully all other LCAs, are completely data-driven. The quality of the results of the LCA is as high as the quality of the data that we collect. So we start collecting all the small data points on every single stage of the life cycle of your product or service, starting from raw materials and moving on to manufacturing and the use of the product and the end of life of the product. We try to collect as much primary data as possible on every single life cycle stage of the product. And then we take that data and we translate that into environmental impact. Of course, if there are gaps in the data for some reason, then we complement the data with secondary data from environmental databases and other literature sources. So as I mentioned, the quality of the data determines the quality of the results of the LCA, so the accuracy of the impact that we calculate. So when the data collection process begins, it might seem a little bit overwhelming maybe, or like a lot of work, but it's very important to remember that the data collection process is always a collaboration between you, the client, and me, my colleague, the LCA practitioner. So we will take you by the hand and support you through every stage and answer any possible questions that you have. When I say that the results of the assessment are pretty much as good as the data used, I mean that we have to pay special attention to the quality of the data that we use. We have to think about such things as uncertainty of the data. So for example, when some data is extrapolated or approximated, etc., or any other assumptions that might be taken. Another point that we'll look at is the transparency of the data. So we like to understand how the data was collected as well. We also check the completeness of the data. So we make sure that every single point in the life cycle, including packaging and forklifts in the factory, etc., is taken into account. So there's no data point that is missing. And we also look at the consistency of the data. Time consistency, making sure that all the data comes from the same time period, as well as the consistency of data sources. So the data collection phase of the LCA tends to be the most time-consuming phase, and it can take weeks, up to 8 weeks in my experience. Of course, how much time it takes depends on how available the data is and how organized the data collection process is. And in order to make sure that the data collection goes smoothly, we also like to organize regular meetings with the client to make sure that there are no big challenges that go unaddressed. And how quickly the project is completed also depends on how quickly the data collection goes. That's why it's so important to make sure that the process is smooth. The first step of any LCA is to determine the scope of the study, what data we need to collect. So a cradle-to-grave scope is usually adopted when the LCA is done for a final product, such as a remote control, for example, whatever I see on my desk. But if we are doing an assessment of a product that is an intermediate product, for example, a raw material that is used to produce other goods, such as plastic granulates, for example, then we will adopt a cradle-to-gate scope, where the system boundaries of the assessment, they start at raw material collection, but they end at the factory gate. So we do not take into account the use stage and the end of life stage. So depending on what scope we have decided on for the LCA, we will collect all the data for the raw materials and the manufacturing, and then maybe for the use stage and the end of life stage of the LCA. So once the scope of the study is determined, then it's also important to determine the functional unit based on which we are doing the assessment. So for example, if we're doing the assessment of those plastic granulates, then we will probably do an assessment per kilogram of the plastic granulates. And if we're doing it for a phone, then it's going to be one phone. And then all the data has to be collected per functional unit. So depending on the amount of product that we are assessing, we need the material and energy inputs that are required per that unit of product. So when you're collecting all of this data, we will ask you to fill out a custom-made data sheet that we provide to you at the beginning of the assessment. And that will include all the fields for the data for different components of the LCA, such as the raw materials, the suppliers of the raw materials, manufacturing energy, etc., etc. And we will expect the whole data sheet to be filled out because, as I mentioned before, we do not like it when there are gaps in the data. However, if you're having trouble filling out the data sheet or collecting certain data, please do not wait for weeks and weeks, but contact us, and then we can understand together where the problem lies and then find a solution together. That's why we like to have regular meetings with the client as well. Also, if you have filled out almost the whole data sheet, but then a little bit of the data is still missing, don't wait, just send it to us and we can start the assessment and the modeling, so translating the data into impact already before we have the rest of the data. Once the data sheet is filled out and we have collected all or most of the data, then we will also ask you for clarifications, and we have some sort of a ping pong match with questions and answers to make sure that the data is as complete, consistent, and relevant as we need. So where do you get this data? Usually, you as the client will know where to get the data on the production inputs and raw materials and energy, etc. Here's a list of possible data sources for the data that we require. So when it comes to the product and bill of materials, the origin of the materials, the product name, etc., then that information is usually provided by such departments as the research and development department or procurement, etc. And sometimes if the manufacturing of the product is outsourced, so for example, your company is located, let's say in the Netherlands, but you outsource the production to a factory in another country, then we will also make a custom data sheet for your supplier, for your manufacturer, so that they could fill it out because they are the experts on the manufacturing process itself. The data on the production processes or the assembly, so the energy used, the description of the manufacturing process, the waste that arises during the manufacturing, and any possible emissions that you're aware of during the manufacturing, that data is usually collected from the facility manager or the process engineer because, again, they know the best about the manufacturing process. The use stage and the end-of-life stage of the life cycle assessment tend to be a little bit more tricky when it comes to data collection, because most of the time they're modeled based on secondary data. When it comes to the use stage, a lot of products do not have any additional material or energy inputs during the use stage, but there are a couple of industries for which the use stage can be very important when it comes to their impact, such as electronics, because you need to charge electronics or keep them plugged in, or for example, textiles, because you need to wash them. And all of that water and energy consumption is taken into account when an LCA is performed. The data on the use stage, so energy consumption during the use stage of the product, will usually come from either standard values from LCA guidelines, or hopefully, if you have performed a customer survey or a market survey, then we will get a better indication of how the product is used. When it comes to the end of life stage of the product, so the treatment of the discarded product when it becomes waste, this is something that you as a manufacturer or a retailer really have very little effect on, unless you have some sort of a take-back program where the customers can send you the discarded product once they're done using it and you maybe recycle it. Unless you have that, then you really cannot influence what happens to it. Because of this, the end-of-life stage is always modeled based on standard scenarios from, again, LCA methodology guidelines or regional statistics on waste treatment. For example, we can check how waste plastic is treated in the Netherlands, what percentage of it is usually incinerated, what percentage is landfilled, and what percentage is recycled. So usually that data comes from our own research. So what do we need from you in terms of data collection in order to proceed with our modeling? So again, as I mentioned, the filled out data sheet. I love it when it's filled out completely because then we can just model everything based on the data. But if it's not complete, please send it to us anyway, and then we can answer all the questions that you might have or that we might have. We also like to have a single point of contact from your side, someone who has an overview of the data collection process that makes the process more simple for both you and us. And lastly, about the timeline, it's important to keep in mind the 8-week deadline, but that is usually the longest that the data collection takes. A lot of the time it will take only 3 or 4 weeks. And of course, that depends on the complexity of your product and your process, and also how quickly you come to us with questions when something is unclear. I would also like to look at our standard data sheet together and go through it so that you have an understanding and a picture of what that would look like when we send it to you. The data sheet consists of all the fields that you can fill out with primary data. So on the first tab, there's just some general information about LCAs. And then we go to the production information. We will need you to fill out the product name, the producer, so your name, or maybe the factory that produces the product. The functional unit, for example, volume, so 1 cubic meter of the product, and the weight per functional unit, so how much, for example, 1 cubic meter of a product weighs in kilograms. After this general information is filled out, then we go to the materials and their transport, so the raw materials required to produce 1 cubic meter of the product. We like to have a full list of all the materials with their specifications as specifically as possible. So we don't want to hear any plastic, metal, etc. What plastic, what metal? Is there anything specific about the metal? Is it steel? Is it galvanized steel? Is it carbon steel? We want to know how much of that steel goes into the product per functional unit. We also want to understand where it is produced and how it is transported to the manufacturing facility, and also preferably the distance from the supplier of the steel to the manufacturing facility, and any other transport that might be included in the logistics chain. We also like to have a list of all the chemicals that are involved in the production of the product per functional unit, and we also like to have their type and CAS number, and maybe a material safety data sheet if it's available, as well as the percentage of active ingredients in the chemical, and the amount used per functional unit again. And not forgetting about the transport. So the chemical is produced, what the distance is to the manufacturing facility from the supplier, and how exactly it is transported there, by ship, by truck, etc. We also like to understand what waste occurs during the manufacturing of the product. We want to understand what exactly the material that is wasted is. Maybe it's losses from extrusion, or maybe it's glue residue or something like that. We want to understand how much waste there is per functional unit of our product. So in this case, 1 cubic meter, and of course the unit in which the waste is calculated. And we also want to understand what happens to the waste. How is it discarded? Is it landfilled? Is it just thrown in a general bin? Is it recycled externally, so sent to a recycler that you collaborate with? Or maybe it's recycled internally, just goes back into the production. We want to understand what happens to that waste. And of course, we want to know what energy and other utilities go into the production of our functional unit of the product, be it electricity or water or natural gas. And again, how much of each is consumed per functional unit of the product manufactured. When it comes to electricity, we also like to understand the energy mix of your electricity supplier. Maybe you just plug in your machinery into the grid, but maybe you chose your electricity supplier based on their energy mix. Maybe it's greener, maybe it's got more wind or solar power. And of course, that will influence the results of the assessment a lot. So we like to understand all of those details. Another bit of primary data that we like to collect from you is the outgoing transport data, or basically the distribution. So where your clients are located, or maybe if you're delivering to another factory, then where that is located. Again, what transport is used for distribution, and the distances, average distances from the production location to the client or another manufacturing location. This concludes the first part of the data collection tutorial. Thank you for your attention, and feel free to click on the next part to learn about some tips and tricks when it comes to data collection.